And guess what? It's testimony night. We're so excited. We get to hear someone that spent at least a year working the steps, finding a lot about herself, struggles, and we get to hear the victory that God brought her. So it's my pleasure to welcome Rose.
I have so wanted to be here, so thank you. I'm going to start with a little water. I'm a believer who's in recovery and struggles with being orphaned, codependency, and overeating. As a child, I had a very idyllic, perfect, Hallmark, holiday card, white picket fence life. I was born in Buffalo, New York. My dad was Superman, or so I thought, and my mom was a perfect stay-at-home, baking apple pies and doting on all of her children. My mom was the youngest of 13 and had never lived on her own, had never worked at all. I had 3 older half-brothers that lived with us full-time and 3 younger brothers. We are an Italian family, and I was the only girl. Not just a girl, but the only girl. The absolute apple of my father's eye. I knew it, and I absolutely loved it and took full advantage of it, as my brothers will tell you to this day. I spent my early years in what I always called my happy house in Buffalo. My father actually built the happy house. I thought everybody's dad just built houses. I had my own room because the East Coast is different from the West Coast, and those years are different because boys didn't sleep in the room with girls. I had my own room. My brothers were crammed on 2 sets of bunk beds with a cot in the middle or something. Every winter, my dad made me an ice rink in our backyard, and the rest of the time I had my own swing set. My dad built the playground down the street as part of the development, so it was also my playground. The world was mine. My birthday parties were full of cousins, families, and friends. I've got a picture where my birthday hat is on, and I'm actually standing on a chair going, it is my birthday, my favorite. People know that this is still my favorite time of year. We didn't have a lot of money, but a very early memory is one winter being banned from our basement without any reason. This went on through the whole winter, the spring, and the summer. And one evening, my mom asked me to go down and get my dad for dinner, and she'd forgotten my restriction. I raced downstairs, and my dad was bent over some junky old rusted bike doing what he was always doing. He pushed me back upstairs. I forgot about it, but I still couldn't go downstairs. My birthday rolled around in August, and my dad wheeled out a new shiny bike that he'd spent all winter working on for me. But that was my dad and my mom, and it was really a wonderful life. I absolutely loved. We had a very small, picturesque, white clapboard neighborhood church, and it actually had a steeple. About 75 people. Sunday best was best East Coast. Ruffled little dresses, lacy gloves, little hats. I loved it. I thought it was fabulous. I had an Easter bonnet, and I wore pretty white gloves. My brothers had matching ties and jackets. The pastor's family came to dinner very often. The church's favorite song every single week was Onward, Christian Soldiers. It's a marching song, and the pianist always started the chorus with that resounding da-da-da-da-da-da, and then everybody would sing at the top of their lungs, Onward, Christian soldiers, marching off to war. It's our little rally song. Every single Sunday, year after year. We loved it. When I was 8, my dad had a heart attack, and it did not kill him, but we suddenly moved to Southern California. He was 40. My wonderful life continued, happy, secure, delightful. I was adventurous and determined. My dad had no more heart attacks in California, just memories. When I was 11, my uncle convinced our family to return to Buffalo for work. My dad took me soon to New York City, just a little time for he and I. Before we left, he instructed me, that if he had any chest pain or fell down, to put his nitroglycerin tablets under his tongue and find a policeman. We had a great time there. I remember seeing the UN and thinking how fun it would be to be an interpreter. Back home, my dad and I would watch movies in the basement. I would travel with him to sales appointments and to office in Rochester, which is about an hour away. And then suddenly one morning, just like in the movies, when there's a horrible screeching, ripping sound and everything freezes, and the picture literally rips in two. My wonderful, happy, secure life just ended. Poof, completely gone. Prior to that morning, my dad would drive me to school every morning on his way to work if I missed my bus. And I'd get to ride with my dad, so I missed my bus every morning. Anyway, that morning, my mom was 6 months pregnant, and I awoke to find my father in great pain, struggling for both breath and words. I wanted to give my dad his pills, but my mom was in charge. There wasn't any 911 then. As my dad was struggling to breathe, I heard him say, "Oh God, who's going to take care of my family?" He wasn't even speaking to me. Hoping to reassure him, I said, "Don't worry, Daddy, I will." A friend once asked me why I didn't say, "Mom will." Perhaps I already knew my mom was not going to be okay. Those were the last words I spoke to my dad. I was sent next door before the ambulance came. My dad was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. Little did I know that my words, "Don't worry, Daddy, I will," when I was only 13, would start my life's journey of codependency, as I did everything I could to keep my promise to my dying father until 2010 when I came to celebrate recovery. I was kept out of school for a week and given large black and purple capsules, to this day clueless what they were. Crying myself to sleep every night, I vividly remember going back to school, seeing my classmates and feeling very, very different from everybody, dazed, overwhelmed, very afraid, very abnormal, insecure, confused, numb and raw, everything except normal. But this was my new normal. I was 13, my sister was born 3 months later. I cared for my sister, including the midnight feedings. My mom was not okay. We grew distant as I continued to grieve for my father. My grades plummeted and I gained more than 50 pounds. I felt no one cared what I did. My role was to help my mom. With no life insurance or savings, my mother decided to lose our family home, and we moved back to Southern California, leaving all of the relatives and family that I had known. We scraped by on my dad's Social Security, being evicted and moving every couple of months. My mom did her very best, but she was deeply overwhelmed, cried every night, telling me how often she saw my dad in her dreams and always said, "Oh, George, you're back now. Now everything will be okay." My brother always tells me that we had heaven and then we went to hell. As bad as losing my dad was, life soon got even worse. When I was 15, already bewildered and overwhelmed, my mom was diagnosed with advanced aggressive breast cancer. School was a complete joke. It was useless. I really didn't have a clue why I was even going. I felt stupid. No one cared what my future might be. No one ever asked what I wanted to be when I grew up. I continued to feel different, alone, overwhelmed, ill-equipped, lonely, and stunned. I didn't have a single friend. Days were spent driving my mom to the hospitals, to the doctors, to the radiation, chemotherapy, and taking care of 4 younger siblings. My mom taught us clearly that it was us against the social workers who said that if I didn't drop out of school to care for my family, they'd be taken away and we'd be split up, and it would be my fault. I'd been suspended once when my mom was hospitalized and couldn't write a note that I'd been home caring for the siblings. I gladly dropped out in 10th grade. I'd only gone for a couple months. One less thing to deal with. I never in my life attended a school dance, a high school event, or a prom. I always learned my sole purpose was to care for my mom and my family. The nurses reported that my mom's cancer got worse and my siblings were taken to a group home for the day. I was now 18, I got them out, and we quickly returned back to Buffalo for my mom's cancer treatment and to avoid social workers. Her treatment was unsuccessful, and my mother died just as I turned 19. My dad died at 47, and now my mom at 43, both natural causes. My overriding memory of the funeral and the confusing days following are of total numbness, stunned, and overwhelmed. My mom had been overwhelmed and grieved deeply for my father, never recovering in any sense of the word, but she had done her best. To my surprise, in the state of New York, I wasn't of legal age to keep my siblings. Legal age was 18 in California and 21 in New York. Just great. I didn't trust any of our relatives. I didn't really know them. This nightmare was continuing. An uncle from San Francisco came, and the New York courts awarded him custody of all of us, deciding it was cheaper to fly us back to California rather than pay for 5 foster kids. Although my uncle testified under oath to the New York court that I could live with him, Unbeknownst to me, my uncle had no intention of giving me a home, none at all, but God already knew. A voice I came to live by is, when my mother and father forsake me, then the Lord will gather me up. We had been renting for less than 2 months in a neighborhood when my mother died. A family across the street always seemed so different. I didn't know them well, but their home always seemed to be filled with a soft golden light, and there was a joy, a kindness, and a calmness always present, even when nothing was being said. I always felt oddly comforted in their home, a feeling I wasn't used to. A few days before we were flown back to California, I went over to be polite and say goodbye. They'd always been so kind. The wife gently handed me a piece of paper and said, "I know you're from Southern California. If you ever don't have a place to go, call this number. It's my family. I've told them about you, and they'll take you in." Little did I know I was about to learn what homeless was. New York State put us on an airplane and launched us out of their hair. My sister always says, somewhere in the clouds between California and New York, I magically came of age crossing the country in that airplane. My uncle met me at the airport and said, "You're of age in this state, you don't get any Social Security, and you're not staying with me. I'm taking you to your aunt's house." I never spent a single second at my uncle's house. My unknown new aunt and uncle were raging alcoholics with raging adult kids, making it immediately clear there was no home for me there. I took out my little folded slip of paper, walked to a payphone, and called that number. In Matthew, Jesus speaks of showing kindness, saying, "For when I was a stranger, you took me in." When the disciples ask, "When did we see you a stranger and take you in?" Jesus says, "For you have done this unto the least of these, your brethren, so you've done it unto me." I definitely qualified as the least of these at that time. This was my lowest point. I vividly recall dialing that phone number, standing on that dusty, noisy street, dejected, rejected, bewildered, overwhelmed, unloved, alone, orphaned, high school dropout, and now separated from my siblings. I was broke, with the knowledge nobody really cared at all what would happen to me. Nobody really cared where we'd even sleep, and what, if anything, I might eat. My wonderful childhood seemed to have all been a very long ago dream, truly another life. Was there really another life where I was adored and happy? Had it even been real? I stood in that dusty street listening to a faraway stranger's phone ringing. My mother had died less than 3 weeks earlier, making me an orphan. I stopped going to church as my mom got sicker. This was 1972, and the Jesus hippie movement was in full force in California. You can imagine I did not fit into the hippie category. The phone was answered with an exuberant young woman's voice, joyfully ringing out the phrase of the day, "Praise God." I can still hear it. Praise God, nothing else. And I'm standing there going, oh, seriously? Seriously, this is just great. Such was my introduction to the family of Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, who took me in, a total stranger. I rededicated my life to God and entered an entirely new world, fascinated, and still am by this day, studying the Bible. The church pastors and the members became family and gave me something I had never known since my dad died: stability and simply feeling cared for. One Sunday, a few months later, I found my siblings and my uncle in the parking lot, holding paper bags of clothes. My uncle no longer wanted them. Business as usual. It never occurred to me to even call a social worker and say, "Hey, what are we going to do with these kids?" I was awarded sole legal guardianship of my 4 younger siblings. I was now 19. Life became extraordinarily hard, but I never said anything because it was really just what I had always done, kept my promise to my dad to take care of our family. I worked full-time for minimum wage at a feather factory, nights and weekends in the church nursery. I babysat, I gave music lessons. I was so exhausted, I never told anyone. I just did what I always did, figured it out, still felt overwhelmed and ill-equipped, but I kept on keeping my promise to my dad. My brothers were teenagers, and my endless 7 days a week of work were very, very hard. In response to the relentless stress, I decided that instead of gaining 50 pounds, I would gain another 70 pounds, weighing close to 250 pounds. For 14 years, I worked 4 jobs, and we scraped by, always out of money, never an extra dollar, eating the famous Kraft orange macaroni and cheese and the ramen noodles and the powdered milk that to this day they still hate. We were so poor, I'd come home to find bags of groceries and dollar bills tucked in our door. My brothers remember the 2.5 chairs we had at the table and the little rabbit purse people would sneak money into. Family members never sent a penny, just me working and raising the kids as best I could while still a teenager myself. Jobs are not real great when you have a 9th grade education and 0 skills, but the kids all knew the Lord. My church family was a constant source of love and caring, but I never told anybody how exhausted and hard it was. My siblings all finished high school, yet the codependency continued as I tried to make up for them being orphaned and feeling I hadn't done a very good job teaching them how to be successful in the life skills, because I didn't have any of those life skills myself. So I just kept rescuing. Once they were all physically on their own, I did get my GED, shocked, absolutely shocked, to score in the country's top 98%. I never even had a clue I had a brain. I completed my associate's degree, became an ABA paralegal, and a licensed stockbroker and financial advisor. But unresolved trauma has a way of making itself at home in your life and then bleeding into every other part of your life. I hid it very well, but I knew I wasn't healthy emotionally, I wasn't healthy physically, financially, or really even spiritually. In my early 20s, I developed crippling panic attacks, feeling I couldn't breathe, severely limiting my work, and my travel was non-existent except for a short distance to the limited jobs I could hold with that kind of panic. When your life's been out of control, you can't trust not being in control. I hid all of this very, very well. I learned to be very self-sufficient when my father died. Feeling I didn't matter at all, I got really good at the facade, but the facade was hard to maintain, especially when you know deep down you're now the one that's really not okay. As emotionally unhealthy as I was, I always knew I'd be made whole. I constantly felt that I lived on 2 mountaintops. Over here, I'm doing my best. It looks good from the outside, but I knew there were a lot of broken places. Yet over here, this was wholeness. This was just joy and content. And I always knew I'd get here, but there was this chasm, and I could not ever figure out how to get there, but I always couldn't bridge that gap. I always liked that scripture where I've been reading it too, in the Bible, where it says, Ezekiel, where I looked for someone to stand in the gap. And I just couldn't figure out how to get over that gap. But I knew God promised healing. I knew it, and I clung to that. I kept running after my healing, yet struggling with gross obesity, lack of education, financial issues, problems with authority, and getting fired, which of course stem from totally being in control from a young age. Endless issues of control, self-worth, feeling overwhelmed and ill-equipped. But I never, ever gave up hope, never. In 2010, I was visiting a relative and read John Baker's book, Celebrate Recovery, and determined to find one. I came that first night to a Celebrate Recovery and asked, where's your step study? I want that step study. I want in that step study. It was the last week, and they said, well, you're coming in the middle. I was like, I want that step study. I need that step study. I remembered from the very first meeting, every single time I'd park my car in the parking lot, I would start to cry. Because I knew that I had found the place where if I didn't quit, I would be made whole. It was like, I am going to hold God's feet to the fire, and you are going to heal me. Because you said you would, and I'm going to see that you do. Anyway, from the entire first step study, as I said, I cried every single week. I made myself one promise. I said, I will do my homework, and I will show up every week, and I will not quit. And I kept showing up, and I can tell you I've now gone through 9 step studies, okay? Yeah. And I loved every one of them. Slowly, I had a lot of stuff. Slowly, issues resolved, and so did the horrific panic attacks. Step 4 says to write the inventory, the painful issues, and share them with a trusted person, our sponsor. With so many issues, I decided to write mine as a chronological autobiography. I sat down at my table, and I wrote one sentence. I wrote, I was born in Buffalo, New York, in my happy house. And I started weeping and weeping and weeping. And I remembered that years earlier, a pastor taught that a man had gone cross-country to his father's grave to offer forgiveness to his father. I knew with instant clarity I needed to go back to Buffalo and make peace with my parents' death and all of the chaos of the ensuing years. I had not been home to Buffalo in 36 years. It wasn't a place of great memories. I thought relatives didn't care. Panic attacks don't let you travel. They just don't. I had no contact with anyone except for a few cards from some kind cousins at Christmas. In truth, at 19, I had been a mouthy, stubborn, know-it-all, determined person who listened to nobody, who thought, if I don't get it done, it's not going to get done. And so my relatives were kind of useless to me, as I am sure was to them. But I was used to taking care of everybody. I really thought nobody there cared. Very strangely, 10 years earlier, with my panic attacks completely restricting me from even riding in a friend's car, I signed up for bank airline miles. No. I flew nowhere, never. Scripture says, before you have asked, I, God, have answered. I was now healthy enough and realized I should make a call and find out whatever happened to all those miles that I signed up for like 7 years earlier. Well, lo and behold, I had 150,000 miles. So I called my brother and went back to New York. It didn't cost us anything. After the plans were made, I called my cousin asking to see her when I visited. To my complete surprise, she insisted we stay with her and said all the other relatives wanted to see us too. Although I rented a car, she met us at the airport, eagerly running up the ramp to meet her. It was so surreal flying there. I kept thinking of the Wizard of Oz as we landed, and I'm looking out at these trees and knowing that I'm back home, where Dorothy has said, you could have always gone home. But I wasn't ready to make the journey. Within an hour of arrival in Buffalo, all my Sicilian cousins descended on the house with food. 2 of my aunts were still alive that had known my parents. Because of Celebrate Recovery, I finally understood my mother as they spoke. Because of Celebrate Recovery, I discovered that the uncaring was really my relative's helplessness at a poor young widow with cancer and 5 young children. As Celebrate Recovery taught me to make amends, I sat at the table with all my relatives and said I was sorry, that I had not known they had cared, and I apologized for being a mouthy, stubborn, 19-year-old know-it-all. They all said, oh, honey, no, don't worry, you weren't. My 94-year-old aunt caught my eye and went, Later that day, my brother and I simply drove around what had been our neighborhood. We went to that little white church where we used to sing. We sat out front, it was raining, and we both were looking at the church, and just very spontaneously we both went, da, 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 onward Christian, and we just sang the song, and we were just crying, and we didn't say a word to each other. We just had tears running down, but, God heals. Laughing was good, and it healed. Now, before I went home, my sponsor had said, I want you to take 5 flowers, 1 to represent each of the family members, including yourself, because I had never seen myself as someone who needed to be taken care of, because I was taking care of everybody. But I want them to take 1 for each person to your parents' grave to symbolize that you are finished keeping your promise to your dad for all of you. You've done all you can. They're in God's hands now, and now you get to have your own life. My dad loved petunias. I got up early before anyone that next day, and I bought 10 petunias, 5 for each grave. The cemetery had just opened, and because of the rain, there were no workers working at all. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning, and it was still kind of drizzly rainy. Rounding this small hill, I remember going there with my dad, I saw this very familiar stone of my dad's grave, and I was suddenly very overcome. It had all been very real. I had really, truly had a dad once who adored me, someone who thought I was special and lovely and delightful exactly as I was. There really had been all that joy once. I suddenly realized, looking around, that I had nothing to dig in the ground, no way to plant these petunias that were so symbolically important, not even a pen. My dad's family's headstone is about a foot thick, it's about 4 feet high, and as I started to walk up the hill, the sun broke through, and through my tears, I saw something really shiny glinting in the sun. I thought it was another gravestone in back of my dad's gravestone. As I got to my dad's headstone, I felt drawn to the shiny spot and saw that there was a bright silver, hand-sized, brand-new planting gardening tool sitting as peacefully as could be on top of my dad's headstone. Not a speck of dirt, not a scratch, not even any adhesive where someone had pulled off a label. It was just sitting there, it had never been used. After Jesus' death and burial, Mary goes to Jesus' grave and finds the giant stone rolled away with an angel waiting there. When I saw that gardening tool, I immediately felt in my heart that an angel had been sitting on my dad's headstone many years, patiently waiting to welcome me home so I could be whole again. God had provided the gardening tool. The moment I saw my dad's name actually on his gravestone, I collapsed on the ground crying uncontrollably, saying, "It was so hard, it was so hard, it was just so hard." I had never, in all the decades since my dad died, ever told anyone it was hard, but I told my dad over and over and over. Finally, I planted each flower, crying and telling my dad about each of his 5 children. Later that day, my cousin took us to my mom's grave, and again sobbing, I repeated planting flowers and telling my mom how her 5 children were doing. On my last day in Buffalo, I drove back to my happy house, and I stood there a very, very long time. Finally, I said out loud, because I do believe that Scripture says, "As I think in our hearts, so you are." I said, I was very happy here. I was loved here. I'm going back to California. I'm going to be every bit as happy in California as I was here, and I'm going to be every bit as loved in California as I am here. I went back down to the playground, which is still there because nothing in Buffalo changes, ever. So everything is still there. And I actually swung on my swing, and they've got these little hobby horses, and yes, I sat on the hobby horses and rocked away. Many changes have occurred since Celebrate Recovery. I no longer get fired from jobs. I started my job the same year I started Celebrate Recovery. I'm happy to say I had my first raise ever at a job at that job, and I've since retired from that job. I completed my master's from Fuller Seminary. I no longer need to be right. I've learned others' behavior comes from their pain, and it's not directed at me. I'm a Billy Graham chaplain. I'm FBI trained. I also maintain a 75-pound weight loss for the years that I've been in Celebrate Recovery. At Celebrate Recovery, I've grieved and worked through being so consumed keeping my promise to my dad and rescuing my family that I have not yet married and have no children. That was a hard one. That was one of the reasons I had to go through so many step studies. I received my ordination as a chaplain on one of my deceased brother's birthday as his son and his beautiful fiancée requested I perform their wedding. God has a very interesting way of restoring all that was taken. On New Year's Eve a year ago, their daughter was born. I was unexpectedly honored as they named her after me. When I was sent her ultrasound, my nephew put a little note in the text, and he said, "Now you have your little Rosie." To this day, it's a great honor. I absolutely love being an auntie, a sister, a cousin, and a friend. And yes, now through Celebrate Recovery, I love being a daughter again. It's been and still is a very wonderful life. But most importantly, to the newcomer and to those that have been coming for a while, I say stay. Whatever the reason is that you came here when you woke up and said, I cannot keep living my life the way I am, the healing for that reason is right here. Please stay for it. I don't know the exact date that I got healed. I don't know what step study. I don't know what endless Friday night that I sat in these rooms and I came. I made a promise I wasn't going to quit. But it happened. It worked. It will work for you too. When you fly, the oxygen mask demonstration, you know, they hold up a little wrinkly bag, and they always say if the bag does not fully inflate, the oxygen is still flowing. And when traveling with a small child, place the mask over your face first, then over the child. I want to say to you, if you feel like CR is not working, just stay. God's healing is still flowing. When you're tired of coming, just stay. God's healing is still flowing. Like rescuing yourself first on the plane so you can help the children or help whomever else, rescue yourself first. My New York court papers said that my orphaned, uneducated, overwhelmed resume left me qualified for homelessness, heartbreak, and a pretty dismal life. But there's another paper written a long time ago that says, "In the beginning, God created." To the newcomer, especially, stay. God says, "You and I are fearfully and wonderfully made." When we were in our mother's womb, God had a plan and a purpose for us. In spite of all the insanity I lived through, God has kept me and He's keeping you. I say to the newcomer, the Bible says, whosoever will can have all of God's promises. I decided I'm a whosoever. And I promise that you're a whosoever. And that God looked down, and when Satan tried his best, God said, not them, not her, not him. They belong to me, and you do. Please stay, for the joy set before him is why Jesus endured the cross. You will be amazed at the freedom and the joy that will be yours if you just stay. Trust CR. Trust the process. Trust God. More than anything, trust yourself. Trust that you are good. Trust that you are kind. Trust that your dreams are still available to you. That all of God's goodness and purposes are still available to you. To the newcomer and to those here, for how many times you've come, just keep staying. You've tried everything else. You won't ever regret it. I never did, and neither will you.